Welcome to the Map It Forward podcast, everybody. Today's episode of the podcast is brought to you by Coffee Fest. I'm sorry that I dropped the ball on that one. Coffee Fest is happening in Tacoma, Washington on the 15th and 16th of November. That's this week. And on the 14th of November, I will be co-leading a leadership workshop with Jen O'Hare at the Alma Mater for a full day. Go to coffeefest.com/leadership to grab your tickets. It's going to be an awesome event, and we're going to be looking at all the different types of leadership. Well, 3.5 leadership styles in the hospitality industry. You will walk away from this with some amazing tools that you'll be able to implement immediately. Today on the Map It Forward podcast, I am so stoked to be welcoming for the first time Professor Peter Roberts. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Welcome.
It's such a pleasure to have you. It is going to be a very fun discussion around data and coffee and reports and all the stuff I don't really get to talk to people about much. So I'm very psyched.
Exciting conversations about data. You don't hear that very often.
Oh, I'm a nerd at heart, but that's okay. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the role that you play in the specialty coffee transaction guide?
Okay. So I'm a business school professor at Emory University. Before I started a socially oriented research center about 10 years ago, I did a lot of work in the global wine industry and got kind of interested in sort of analyzing data on things like prices so you could better understand kind of how we price wines. Fast forward into the work in coffee, when we started looking to try to understand and make an impact in coffee, there just wasn't a whole lot of consistent information about the prices that were paid for roasted coffees, but also for green coffees. And so this project, I would very unabashedly say, was stimulated by a conversation with Chad, who led me to believe that there were folks out there that would contribute data to the project. And so I'm just basically consider myself a curator of data and the guy that calculates medians, right? So just making sure there's a bit of integrity in some of our processes and make sure that the reports that we produce are reliable, they're appropriately annotated, and that they're to the extent that a guy who's been a university professor for 20 years can be accessible, that they're accessible to people who need to understand them.
You are doing quite well at curating your career around a couple of really great things there. You went from wine to coffee. It was a deliberate.
It actually started way back in pharmaceuticals, spent a brief time into wine and coffee, so you can draw.
You are doing great. You know how to pick them, don't you, sir? I've started with pharmaceuticals and then I thought maybe I've dabbled with this enough. Hotels, then wine, then coffee. What's next, I wonder?
I'm pretty sure that next probably is some form of an early demise. Would be
bring them all together somehow.
I'm pretty convinced that the challenges in coffee will keep us in this for a good long time. I call this somewhere between our death and retirement project. So hopefully we've got 15 to 20 years to do some good.
It's quite the clusterfuck, isn't it?
It's just fundamentally broken, and it's broken in ways that are sort of systemic and historical and structural. And I just think it needs a bunch of people that can look at, the individuals and organizations that populate coffee are all good people. They don't lack ethics, but the system's broken, and market systems need to evolve along more productive trajectories. And there's a lot of potential out there for coffee farmers, and it's just not getting realized.
When you say that it's fundamentally broken, tell me how. You're not an outsider to coffee. We've adopted you, and we're happy to have you. Mm-hmm. But you did come into being in this space as someone who isn't a career coffee person. Yeah. So you did bring some outside perspective. Yeah. Tell me what this situation looks like to you as somebody who has the added added perspective of not being in it day in, day out.
Yeah, and that is the role that I play, and the conversations with Chad and with other folks in the industry. Trying to be very clear. There's no way that somebody's been at this for only 5 or 6 years has the depth of perspective that some of the other folks have. But I can bring a comparative lens. So when I first started thinking about coffee, I've always been interested in consuming it. And I was very surprised at how the advent and growth of specialty coffee looked an awful lot like the New World wine boom that was kicked off in the late 70s and early 80s. So back there was a very conservative global industry, but then for whatever reason, always blow up for people to grow wine in California and Washington and Argentina and Chile. And you had this just massive explosion in opportunity. And I remember at the time going, wow, same sort of growth in interest, same sort of explosion on the upside, interested in where things come from. But I sort of said with a bit of an internal smile, nobody has bake sales for vineyard owners. Like, why is it that if you own a Napa vineyard, people go, oh, you poor soul. But it didn't look like the economic fortunes of the folks that grew coffee beans. Right, were the same as the folks that grew wine grapes. And so you just start with that idea and you go, well, there's so many similarities, there's some differences, but one of the big differences are these distances. So wine and grapes and winemaking are cheek and jowl because they have to be. Coffee growing and coffee roasting are worlds apart. And so the distance, the culture, the time zones, the language, the histories, so it means that you just don't have a chance to see the two linked stages along the value chain evolve together. And so we just started looking at things like what was going on with retail prices at the lower end and the upper end of specialty coffee, and they were exactly what you'd expect them to do. But then you go back and anecdotally start looking at what people were getting paid to grow those coffees. It was always a conversation that started with commodity, right, and started with the state of the market. And you're kind of going, why are we talking about the market when there's really two, right? And, the second market specialty has just all kinds of features that should make you're a young person, should make you excited about growing coffee.
It's interesting.
And so there was this idea.
Go ahead.
No, I can talk forever.
It's interesting that you say that because you just made a distinction between two markets there. I think that perhaps we have many more markets than just two and Chad and I were speaking, your partner in crime with this project was speaking last week about this brand crisis that coffee has. And the idea that I think the fundamental underpinning of the coffee price crisis is actually a coffee branding crisis, because we call instant coffee, we call cold brew coffee, we call batch brew coffee, we call a pour over coffee that costs $100 a cup coffee, we call elixir coffee, we call all of these things coffee. And yet what we're asking the end consumer to do is draw a correlation between all of these different expressions of this very complex agricultural product that has such variable price range. And yet we're angry at why they won't understand that they need to start paying more so that we can then start paying people at the beginning of the supply chain.
So it's really interesting, and I don't know if it was on purpose or not, but like going straight to consumer is just not my instinct anymore. Because we used to sort of have these conversations back when I did wine about people would always assume that like wine, the average wine consumer has any agency at all over price. And I just used to chuckle, like, when was the last time you went into a bottle shop and negotiated, right? You just go into a bottle shop and have someone advise you, and you have a desire to say, listen, I know what my price points are, I know what my taste is, am I interested in an ordinary beverage, or am I interested in something special with a story? Is this of gift caliber? Does it signal something about my tastes? But we as consumers are kind of led through by our channels. And the real issue, I think, when it comes to participating in wine and in coffee is flip it over. Like, we make an inordinately variable set of demands on coffee growers. And we wonder why, why won't that cooperative sort their coffee so I can have more of my 89 fancies? It's because you're basically tacking on a 30-cent premium on top of it. It's not worth it. right? But if you actually priced the 89 to a grower that was commensurate to what the consumer was willing to pay, if someone said you can have like a buck 50 for the normals and you can have 450 for the specials,
Yep.
you would have a lot more sorting, going on at origin. So I think that there's this. I think that whole notion of recognizing plurality and allowing everybody up and down the value chain to sort of see how things are evolving. And Chad and I talk about this a fair bit. Just this, common information, common networks allows humans to just basically meet one another on sort of more equitable terms. And
I think a big part of the problem there is that we're all having different conversations than the people who are the end consumer. The wine industry has done a fabulous job of marketing itself, mostly because the people who own the farms are very rich people. And there's not colonialism going on there.
Yeah, I think I actually don't think on the consumer side, like we have to rewind about 20 years to think about like where the new world of wine was, back in. So I think if you start a clock and think about maybe like a solid decade into it, all those early stories, I remember Bottle Shock where the Californians went up against the French, and it took a while to change people's minds. But I think what ended up happening is that everybody sort of knew what was happening. And
there was a concerted effort, right?
Yeah, that's right. And we're convincing. I always pause with this idea, this sort of that more appropriate compensation for farmers sort of needs to be sort of this, always this and one, on top of what consumers are paying. So I'm already paying $3.50 for a cup of coffee. You want me to pay another? No, I think I just wanted the farmer to get the share of the $3.50, right? And so consumers are paying money for coffee, but just the adjustment processes over time meant that we allocated all of those price improvements and revenue enhancements elsewhere along the value chain on the assumption that the farmer would keep growing the coffee. And I always just chuckle right now when you just listen to these people talk about the current prices. They always talk about, we have a glutton coffee. We have way too much coffee, and we're so worried that because the prices are so low, we're not going to have the coffee we want moving forward. And you go, well, wait a minute, is it too much or too little, right? Because if we have too much coffee, then having less coffee moving forward is not a bad thing. That's called an adjustment.
Right.
But what you're simultaneously saying is we have too much shitty coffee. I should be careful. We have too much ordinary coffee, commodity coffee over there. We don't know how to price differently. Right. And therefore, we are unable to pay the specialty coffee growers enough, right, to give, for them to give us what we want.
Well, I think it's even more complex than that, if you don't mind me saying. I think we're in a situation now where and this is not all commercial coffee producers, but a lot of them, particularly smallholder coffee producers, are in a situation where they've been through cyclically a couple of coffee price crises now. And every cycle they accumulate, particularly if their farms are generational, the burden of debt that they hold with those, they are inheriting across the decades. Yeah. And so their ability to have some room to adjust their farming practices now from commercial to specialty without outside investment is just not possible.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that, again, just to nitpick, I think I've now come to the conclusion that we should not be talking about another coffee crisis, price crisis. I think we've had one since origin, right? I think in the beginning, coffee being imprinted on colonialism and slavery and not figuring out the appropriate returns to land and labor, like from the very beginning. And so what we have is, and so you have this thing right now where you're right, there are opportunities facing forward for coffee growers that the history does not allow them to participate in. And so we do these projects, built around the transaction guide, where we're going down and we're working with small women coffee growers right now in Guatemala. And we just basically, this is what the business professor does. Let's talk about where the money came in last year. Let's talk about where you spent it. Let's use the transaction guide to talk about, well, what might be viable price niches for you moving forward.
Right.
Right? And and if you look at these like normal businesses, you go, wow, your problem right now is you're not being paid enough. Now, the good news is if you look at the collective actions of some of the more progressive growers, there might be opportunities for you. But the problem is right now, and we're very transparent with them, I wouldn't make these investments if I were you, unless someone like me could tell you that the prices that we're seeing in the guide could actually become prices that I can hold on to.
That's
But
assuming that
right
the
now,
data is that you have enough data for it to be reflective of the actuality of the situation rather than the data being skewed towards.
or yeah, or even if the data are skewed towards the quote unquote progressive
Right.
element of the market, what you want to do to an entrepreneurial farmer is saying, can you grab onto the progressive part of the market? Right. So I wouldn't, like I always say with a certain smile, if you want to call my project the progressive specialty coffee transaction guide, I'd be okay with that. Right. And if you want to say that these are the prices that you should aspire to in a more progressive market, but then the question for the grower is, do you have access to the buyers and therefore the prices, right, that are implied in the guide? And
And a lot of them, for a lot of them, the answer is we don't have enough money to eat, let alone spend money on marketing to get access to the people who
yeah,
want to buy our coffee.
I think it's a weird thing. It's one step removed from money that makes it even harder, right? We just don't even have the access, right? Historically, we've sort of sat here. Isolation, I think, is at the root of all of this.
Yeah.
Is that and if you can't leverage your social capital to create new and better buying opportunities, then you're in this thing that says, I guess, what, I have to buy access, kind of into a market.
Yep.
But you watch, and the reason we always tell people, I'm going to guess the solution to this is 10 years minimum, right? And the question is that can you paint a future for the farmers that we work with that in 10 years, if I got that, like, am I prepared to kind of slog through the adjustments?
Do you think we have 10
To your
years?
point,
Do you think we have 10 years?
I think at the macro level, no. At the micro level, I mean, entrepreneurs are awesome. I stand up and tell them, I said, the good news about working with an entrepreneur as opposed to a farmer is I don't have to get right to your farm to help an entrepreneur. I just have to get the opportunity close enough that you'll grab it. And what people like me should be doing is, trying to bring as much of that opportunity structure forward as possible, but then find the one or two most amazing farmers that grab them and go, can I write a case about you? Because what you did was awesome, right? Yeah. And some other people have to know, because there is a different way to sell into differentiated markets that farmers have to adjust to. I mean, it's not like, oh, could I just open my eyes one day and just sell to the same people in the same way at better prices?
Right.
The differentiated market says, like, I need to pick my quality points that are feasible and reasonable. I have to kind of look at my ability, to develop robust networks, of buyers. I have to negotiate all those kind of things over time. So we'll continue to see distributions of prices, from lower than I want to higher than I want. But
and it's one of those things that learning how to do this, and this is the thing that we're experiencing at both ends of the supply chain, right? Where we're seeing that there are farmers where all they were really required to do previously, in their mind, was produce coffee. Mm-hmm. And now we're requiring them not only to produce coffee, but we've told them, but you need to run an effective business.
Yeah. I need your coffee to be better. I need your coffee to be more reliable. I need you to be sort of on top of some of the taste trends, because it seems that jasmine's all the rage this year. So I need you to, but again, I think in order to kind of look at where you want this to be, mm-hmm. like, what you want to do is not try to dampen that. I mean, that's the world of wine that we talked about, right? Like, there's certain things you do to quote unquote get the big bucks, and it relates to being awesome, and it relates to being famous, and it relates to being, so there are different kinds of opportunities that sit kind of in different places in the market,
right?
And what we need to do is, first of all, we need to kind of like, and this is where the transaction guide comes in, you need information about specialty coffee to stabilize, right, around things that are more sensible. I had a conversation with someone who writes for one of the commodities, writes for one of the newspapers, and they talk about this idea of adjustment, right? And I think the example was Honduras, and I said, well, there's two adjustments. I said, adjustment at the lower end: can you effectively participate as a commodity coffee grower when you don't have efficiency and scale? That could be very sad, moving forward. But the thing that we got talking about was this difference between, I'm currently kind of in the high 70s with the capability of being in the low 80s. And I have the capacity to put reliable containers of coffee, together at the 81, 82 level. But that requires investment. And
where do they find it?
Yeah, well, where you get it. But even now, I would say, but even if you could rally the resources, I would tell you now, don't do it. Like if I was your advisor, because the way we're pricing the 81s, 82s is still bouncing up and down with the C, right? With this, voluntary, do I want to give you a 15 cent, a 20 cent, or a 30 cent differential on that? If I'm going to move into that idea, I can do 3 to 5 containers of 81, 82 coffee. I want to know that the price is going to be stable because the margins will not be huge. But I also want to know that as you want more and more of that moving forward, that I will see a steady rise in those prices over time. And that's the kind of pricing context that I would invest into.
Well,
and I don't get that. It's
not that the prices, the margins are going to be small. The margins are not, they're in the loss category. They're not.
Right now they are, for sure.
That's what I'm saying. Like, it just makes no sense right now for them to continue.
I showed you a stable $1.60 that was going up like at the median, a nickel a year, and the transaction guide showed, reliability and stability. And instead of actually defaulting down to a C price when it falls, if someone goes, no, producing a reliable 81, 82 container of coffee is not commodity coffee, right? And it's priced differently. Then you sit down with the grower and you say, and this is where the workshops come in, do you have the capacity to make money at those price points? Some yes, some no. Mm-hmm. And that's where you kind of go, like, if you're at low altitude and you're small and you don't know how to grow anything more than 80, 81 coffee, then says you better have a bang up cooperative, right, that can aggregate and this kind of stuff. And but our small contribution to all this, right, is to actually have these pricing references in a specialty market, right, that are tailored to the different needs in specialty.
Right.
And they're not commodity, right? And so that would be, we talked a little bit before we started, does this solve a problem? Absolutely not. Does it create the preconditions where more people will be able to problem solve? I think so.
On that, do you think that this situation is solvable?
Well, as I mentioned, it all depends on what direction I want to motivate myself or others.
Right.
I think it's really, really important to know that we're not dealing with a situation where a couple of years ago life was awesome, right? And
it's been shit for a while.
It's been forever, right? So I think that did the world suck 100 years ago and 200 years ago? Kind of did, right?
Yeah.
Expect there to be an element of world that will continue to suck for the next 100? So I think of solving the problem, the answer will be no, but creating a context in which more people can solve their own problems, that slightly more humble aspiration, I think, can be realized.
The off-putting part about it for me is the only reason that we give any fucks right now, and this is quite, I guess this is the disheartening part about it for me, but not surprising. The only reason we give any fucks now is because we're threatened.
Yeah.
The people at the consumer end,
mm-hmm.
The roaster, the cafe, the coffee drinker, our supply chain is threatened.
Yeah.
Like, how dare we?
But, and this is where the somebody who's been looking at markets for the whole time, I always tell everybody, I said, markets are not friendly places, right? There can be friendly people in them, but the thing that you just described, where I only actually care at the moment, oh my God, I can't get my whatever.
My supply is affected.
You can imagine I'm going to my auto body shop and I spend most of my time thinking about how she's just ripping me off left, right, and center and trying to hammer her down to get another $30 off. Right. And it's only when I drive her out of business that I go, damn, I missed my auto body shop. So I think the issue that, that we have sort of that, we only care when it hurts us. Now, what we need to do, I think, is the people, and this is where the folks that are working with Chad and I, the data donors, mm-hmm. should be called awesome, because to want to buy coffee at terms that are favorable to my own business, but I want to buy in a market basically that allows there to be the right incentives, the right inducements on the producer, but also on myself, that says, don't go shopping too hard for sales, right, in the current environment, because like long term, you need a market that produces prices that keep your supply coming. And
but on that, we're not. I mean, they're awesome. Like that's not what I'm not going to contest that they're awesome.
Yeah.
I think that the fact that they're focused on paying above a fair price for coffee is awesome. But let's not twist it in saying that this is purely for the producer that they're doing this. These people are smart business people that have worked very hard at securing their supply chain into the future. And that is an integral part. If people who are listening to this need incentive as to why the fuck they should be doing this, I'm giving you an answer now. If you need motivation to start paying the farmer more, the producer more, people down the supply chain more, it's purely to secure your long-term supply chain.
Absolutely. But again, that statement is simply descriptive, right? Because that's the, I think that, so this is, and again, I'm an outsider that just sort of story tells every now and again. The only thing that ever induces somebody to pay more than they want, right, is a well-functioning market, right? The car buyer.
Say that again.
The only thing that ever induces somebody to pay more than they want to, right, is the market tells them that the price is higher. Do you think people want to spend $1,000 on an iPhone? It's just that the market says. So I was like,
this is what it costs.
If I went to my dean and said, the finance guys are getting paid more than the orgs people, I want to raise, she would just laugh at me and say, go back to your office.
I love that your dean is a she, by the way.
Erica's awesome. But if I went back and said Stanford University offered me a $75,000 raise to come work at Stanford, I have a better chance of getting my raise. So
she'll start counting her cash.
If people think that what Chad and I are doing, or at least what I'm doing, I want to speak for Chad, is sort of creating a context where you can decide the right amount to pay for your coffee. That's not what I'm doing. I'm creating a context where the people who sell the coffee can know what it's worth, and that over time they can develop a position where all you're allowed to do as a buyer is bid, right, or ask, right, and the seller will tell you, right, if that's a good price for me, right? And if we're looking at this, the best price in a market, you think about any negotiation, the best negotiation is when both sides feel a little ripped off. I could have got that a little less. I could have got a little more. We have never been there in coffee, right? We have had this thing where someone goes down and says, oh, I'm so terribly sorry. Here's what I'll do for you. And we have too many different things about people explaining to me like how hard it is to be like a coffee roaster. And it is. It's in no way, shape, or form is it a straightforward business. But what you really want is create a context where both those sides come together on parity. They're looking at the same information. They've been socialized the same way, that we understand that if you want to sell excellent roasted coffee, you have to buy excellent green coffee, right? If we're having these conversations trying to convince my consumers that you're gonna have to pay me a little more if you want the exquisite stuff, right? That thing should translate down and saying that someone's gonna say, you're gonna pay me a little more if you want me to grow that exquisite stuff, right? So if we can kind of create that marriage along the supply chain, then every time someone tries to get a consumer to spend a little more, and they should, there's no reason why you should go to a restaurant and drop $12 for a glass of wine and then roll your eyes when someone wants to charge you $3 for a double espresso. Like that's just a weird imbalance by itself. But if this was all sort of linked to common knowledge, it's a market that works better, right? And a market that works better on average produces better outcomes.
And this is why I'm saying that the idea that we have a branding crisis in coffee, that when we should be helping people understand that specialty coffee is like the Penfolds of wine, and then even in that range there is a Grange, and that you should be understanding that there are layers to the industry, and it's not all $1 a cup. It's not even all $3.50 a cup. Everybody seems to be, the person who I think is doing not so bad at the moment is the roaster. From everything that we've been able to see and dissect, excuse me, in the who's making the money. That's the fundamental question I've been asking this year. Who's making money in the coffee supply chain? The person who's making the most money in the coffee supply chain right now is the roaster. They have the greatest control because they have the greatest room for fuckery. Mm-hmm. They can put commercial coffee in a bag that's got specialty coffee written on it. They can make much more money out of it than they're letting people know that they are. I mean, even with regards to your transaction guide, I was saying to Chad last week, and I want to talk a lot about this with you right now, is the idea of data integrity. Mm-hmm. If we are counting on these folks that are donating the data to you to provide us with the data, to provide you with the data that's going to spit out the results that we need, how do we know that they're giving you all the data?
Yeah, the true answer is you don't. Most projects like this, I believe, they don't start with sort of robust systems to counter malfeasance. They start with well-intending people like wanting to do good things and building around trust. I can say with 100% confident that I am 100% confident that while there might be noise in data as people try to bring everything together and produce a file in a way that no one's asked them to do before, there's an awful lot of work that goes into that. And anytime that you have work, you might have things that need to be checked down the road. I'm 100% sure that the people that are participating right now are participating on good faith and they're giving us what we asked for. I'm also not, if you wanted to go one step further, and this is again an expression with a bit of a smile on my face, I'm not sure people yet know how to game this, even if they wanted to. Because the question I get, for example, is what's to stop people from just giving you their best prices, to make them look better? I said, well, first of all, you're anonymous, right? So you will never have a roaster X result from this. If you really wanted to game my system on pure self-interest, you would give me your shitty prices, right? Because then the guy would end up showing lower prices and you would end up looking better when you negotiate. So I said, the fact that your instincts were to give me prices that make the world think that the average price is higher than it is, right, suggests that you haven't really thought through the strategery.
Well, I think that there's always this idea that potentially somehow the data may get out there with the worlds that we live in, mm-hmm. and that somehow the data, the raw data with names attached, could get out there with regards to either hacking or a mistake or whatever. We know these things happen. There is some prestige that's going to be associated with this. You know what I'm saying? Like people are going to.
I don't want to say for a second that at some point in time, i.e., in the next 3 years, as we roll this out, that we will need systems that are more robust. Okay. I will not be able to say with certainty, that there isn't certain people that are going behind the scenes and going, this is the best way to do it, or don't do that just in case. My job is to kind of look through and say, like, do I see anything on various cuts and subcuts of the data that make it look like I'm more interested in, the extent to which people know where the data are more robust and where they might be a little bit more in need of more data. So we spend an awful lot of time just making sure that I'm not producing, distributions from cells that are underpopulated. So we have a rule that says, it started out as more than 30, it turns into more than 50, but as we get a larger sample, I'm not going to bother with showing you the median min max of something that has 8 contracts in it because it doesn't help.
Right.
And some of the things that people do and don't want to do with the data in terms of making kind of inferences. The beauty of my position is at the end of the day, interpretation belongs to the various people in the market. All we do is we produce. Mm-hmm. And so there's a little bit of this, there's no running commentary that goes, Chad and Peter give 2 thumbs up to the following people. This is just a plain old description of prices. Right. And moving forward, when I try to be as transparent as possible. Will we ever have a fully audited system? No. Simply because we will not get the resources that we need to pull that off. But you also, if you want to be an auditor, you have to have fiat. right? I have to be able to tell you to open my books. And right now, we have voluntary associations, so I will not hoist my middle finger on the screen here, but that's what you'd get. If you made data donation too difficult for folks, they would simply not do it. I don't have time. But will we have processes that involve checks that allow us to look things, that will be able to take a random sample and run them by, making sure that it's both party transacted. So if a seller donates data, can we have verification on the buyer side and vice versa? All kinds of great plans are being hatched. And hopefully what people see is that if this ever gets to the point, I mean, we're at 55 data donors now. And the names that are going to come out in December in terms of the additional folks, right? Mm-hmm. We had 21 and then we have 38, now we have 55. This suggests that there is this, and when I use the word progressive, I don't mean progressive like they have a bigger heart than the next one. When I talk about progressive industry actors, they're going to say we need a market context, right? That, to your point from before, that ensures the long-term reliability of supply, which basically says that prices adjust so that relative scarcities are accounted for. So if I need more 89s coming out of Guatemala, then I've got appropriate inducements for growers to produce that coffee. I think we're going to hit our targets by having 55. Hopefully it becomes 70, 75 next time. 90 becomes 100. And once we're at that point, you will always be able to wonder whether there's a part of the market that is sort of underrepresented. But I will then always smile and say, do you think yet it's better than the C price? Right, as an appropriate place to start a conversation, right, about specialty coffee. I think we're there now. We're 10 times past that now.
Who do you want to start the conversation with, though? Because, excuse me, specialty is such a tiny, tiny part of the market.
20%?
It's still tiny compared to the rest of it.
Yeah, but think about it. I mean, I used to feel that. Let's put it this way. I used to hear that a lot.
Is it really 20% though?
I mean, the beauty of having no data is it depends on who you talk to. I've heard, SCA would have us believe that half the coffee that's sold, is specialty.
Well, that's the thing. We don't know the numbers. I can tell you that Nestle sells 6,000 cups of coffee a second. Mm-hmm. We're not even close to that in specialty. We could only dream of those kinds of numbers.
Yeah. I'm not 100% sure if you draw specialty all the way down to the Starbucks and Caribou's on up and this kind of stuff. It's let's put this, we'll see where the volumes and the dollars represented by our data are growing in tandem. So you can talk about whether or not we have an appropriate share. I'm not necessarily looking to describe the world of coffee.
Right.
I'm looking to create a set of benchmarks that are more appropriate places to start conversations about prices. And so if someone ever wanted the global survey of coffee, let's put it this way. If someone came to me and said, I think I could do this, would you like to participate? That would be awesome. But if we get to $1 billion worth of coffee, right, sold this year, like all you have to do is, I don't think it's trivial. Are you comfortable that it has reasonable representation through micro lots up to container lots from the Uber specialties all the way down? I'm 100% convinced that we have to use the word specialty to describe the containers that the Caribou's and the Starbucks and the Pete's buy, right? And not have this thing where we're just talking fancy. Because Starbucks is fully ensconced, within specialty coffee, there's a fair bit of volume, in there.
Right.
But there's also the other thing that says, if I'm a small grower, right, and right now I have a good relationship with a cooperative, but if I start and say 80-20 in terms of the percentage of my farm, 80 is fairly ordinary coffee that's heading over to the cooperative, but I have the chance, to sell 20% of my coffee that is, it's micro and it's really good. The small farm economics, becomes much more attractive if I can get real and solid prices for those 20%. While we actually sort of work the other side, which says, make sure we're still earning money on the 80.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of different ways that we can dismiss it. But I also think, going back to your discussion before, like, how do you take a big forever problem and solve it? You got to start with the small pieces, right? And even if you just think it's small, It's small but not important. I had a guy who came up and said something about, because he was trying to get the big thing, and I was talking about getting this much for a micro lot, and he sort of mumbles to himself like, well, who cares? I said, the farmer that sold the micro lot.
Right. And
And
and as we had a quick discussion before we went live on air. Excuse me. And I was saying to you how there, a new person pops up every week telling me that they've got the app that is the solution. This is what's going to solve the coffee price crisis. No, it's not. There is not one anything that's going to solve a generations long crisis that was created by colonialism.
And if you just really look back at what markets do, like think of the one time that the market introduced a solution and never evolved again.
Right.
The whole concept of having a more productive market context is so problems keep being able to solve. So if I can tell a story of a young patrona who's a coffee grower in Guatemala who basically uses the transaction guide plus the revised social capital to sell more of her coffee at more favorable terms, that doesn't solve the problem, but it solves a problem.
Right.
When the guy from Guatemala stands up and says, never really had the vocabulary to communicate appropriate pricing, but when I saw the guide and I located our coffee and said the median price was good for me, and I went to my buyer and she said, good for me too, right? And I said, I don't think it's ever going to happen like that again. but I said that also, so the idea of 25 million smallholders, like we're not looking to necessarily solve a problem. We're trying to create a market context where more of those growers, right, are able to solve more of their problems moving forward.
And am I right in drawing a correlation there that's saying, or adding to that by saying that the reason that this is important is because right now the only benchmark that people have is the C market?
Yeah. That is, so if somebody asked me what is we presented out at Royal last week, and the language of an email, this is the arrogant professor, can you please tell me the narrow problem you're trying to solve? And go, I'm not working on a narrow
Are you fucking kidding?
No, but it was a very good question, because it was right. What's the narrow problem? The C price as the price reference for specialty coffee is fundamentally flawed. So the narrow problem is, sub that out. Make it so that once you're not trying to buy a container of ordinary coffee at some point in the future, but I'm pointing to this coffee and I want it to be mine, right? Right now you're in the world of specialty because that's my coffee. Now that my coffee can be a container of 80 and that my coffee can be a sack of 94. Right. But the whole idea of going back and saying, where would you start that conversation about what we should pay? And I would go back and we use our, for the folks in North America, our Kelley Blue Book reference or Zillow reference that says when you're talking about pricing a differentiated product, what you're trying to do is you're trying to find nearby and localized references, right? So if I'm trying to buy the 2017 BMW and someone says, oh, but we had a surplus of 2006 Kias, whatever appeared in Bangladesh, and the global market for autos, right, is down, you would go, I was interested in the 2017 BMW.
Right.
And so I think our narrow, our micro, our first step is to say, if more of those prices that were paid last year, if those distributions were revealed, right, the market the individual protagonists in the market, buyers or sellers, can look at where they are, right, relative to the distribution, and they can make adjustments. And the market, basically based on the collective adjustments of buyers and sellers, can tell you like whether or not the $1.55 is too low, right? And I would even say right now that I always tell producers to look at the upper end of the distribution. I said, do you want to be average forever, right? But if if somebody's getting $2.40, right, and not $1.55, why don't you start a conversation with your buyer and says, what does it take to become special, to you?
Well, and this is to my point before. A lot of them don't know what it takes to become specialty coffee, and the investment required to educate them and to elevate their producing practices to the level of, producing 84 scoring coffees is an unreasonable, privileged perspective to come from.
Yep. But going from 79 to 81 and getting more and better reliable prices because we could stabilize those things, I completely
who knows? The important part of that, and I think a common thread throughout this conversation, is we don't have enough understanding. We don't have enough data. We don't have enough conversation happening right now that is connecting all of these things together. My point with bringing these conversations to this podcast, particularly in the fact that we do them live, is so that people can hear the authentic, dire situation without being edited.
Yep. And I think that the notion of sort of participating in a sort of a collective conversation, that's the idea. And I don't know whether this makes sense to anybody but me, right?
Okay.
But it's in my head that when everybody in the world is forced to look at the same thing, right? Then what ends up happening is there's a framing thing that comes with that. And why the C is so nefarious is not just the fact that it's a low price, it's a volatile price, is that it induces everyone to assume that it's perfectly appropriate to use a commodity orientation when I'm buying a specialty product. Right. And so if we could move that out and say, like, if everybody in the world who's in the specialty coffee, instead of saying the C price is, like when we update this year and talked about the buyer's guide, and so people will take table 6 and they'll flip it open, right? Then immediately, like, the seller can decide based on the range, median's not good for me, right? I got to get myself up towards the 75th percentile. And the buyer can look at it and going, median's a little on the high side, for me. I'm going to try to get this at more like at the 40th percentile. But the fact that we're not collectively demurring to the C price, but we're both looking at these more recent and more proximate distributions, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to be like, oh, awesome, 2 thumbs up, I got exactly what I wanted. But there's that overall orientation. That next point of what questions now need to be answered now that we're seeing more and better and more proximate information. I always tell people, you guys are way obsessing on the medians, right? I think the gap between the 5th and the 95th percentile across all these buckets is much more interesting than the median, because it suggests that other things besides quality and lot size are being priced. Right.
And that will only come out the more data we have over a longer period of time, which is
people like me putting a coalition together and putting a grant proposal in to say, wouldn't it be great to do multi-country research that tried to go in and look at what were the conversations like at the low end of that distribution versus the high end? What factors on the producer side or on the buyer side or on the context side?
Well, it's a 20-year study, isn't it?
Well, we'll go faster than that. But it's a 20-year enterprise for sure.
Right.
The study will be faster.
Something I wanted to ask you, and I want to now deep dive into what the report is and the data behind it and whatnot. But right now, if you look at, so for anybody who hasn't seen the transaction guide, go to transactionguide.coffee, select the language you want to read it in, hit it on there, scroll right down to the bottom, and you can enter your details and then click download on, and you'll get a copy of the guide. This is the guide for 2018. And it is a 14-page guide that is not a difficult read. If you're worried about whether you're going to understand it or not, I would probably say if you give yourself some room to understand it and spend some time with it, it's not a difficult read. Peter, you've done a great job at trying to make this approachable to a lot of people. Congratulations on that. And having said that, I know that you and Chad know that there's a long way to go with regards to this, but this is the second report, right?
Yeah.
So it is, I think you guys have tried very hard to simplify it as much as possible. That's an assumption I'm making. I haven't asked anybody that. Is that correct?
Yeah. It's trying to make it so that when you sit down and have those conversations about prices, that the information is available to you. You have everything you need and nothing you don't.
Right. So there are some oversimplifications for anybody who's a regular listener of this podcast will know that things like they refer to in the guide the global coffee supply chain. And it goes from farmer to support organizations to exporters to importers to roasters. Well, there's a couple of, there's still a cafe that's a part of the supply chain there. Yeah. And I see the customer, the end consumer, as a part of the supply chain as well there. Regular listeners of this podcast know that we refer to the we refer to it more like a coffee supply matrix.
Yep.
Rather than a supply chain. The chain suggests that it's somewhat linear and it's anything but I think you've done, for the purposes of the report, the reason that you've done that here is so that you can kind of bring everybody to a certain language and unify people around language. Is that correct?
Yep. And the supply chain was meant not necessarily to sort of holistically describe, but to sort of identify like where data donations might come from. So the reason that we would truncate it at a roaster is because very few instances where a consumer would come up and say, hey, I bought coffee and I have data for you. So the roasters donate data, the importers, the exporters, the folks working with producers. So that's why that gets a bit stylized. But you're absolutely right. If you're looking for a treatise on the state of coffee, you will find the transaction guide to be a little on the thin side, because you're going, man, it's just about prices and it's just about...
Right. But on that point, as we were saying earlier, the situation that we are currently in, and the crisis, if people want to call it that we are currently in, is not a coffee price crisis. It is a much, much, much more complex situation than just calling it a coffee price crisis.
Yep.
It is a situation that many things across the coffee supply chain need to be fixed.
Yep.
And the first step of that is starting to use a microscope to hone in on the different things that are required. Price is one of those things. We need to get people across the whole supply chain, from producer all the way to cafe owner.
Yep.
We need to get people education in marketing. We need to get them education in business studies, how to read financial statements, all of that. The same thing is being reflected at either polarity of the supply chain. And so there's a lot that needs to be fixed. This is just honing in on one part. So when people say, if we fix the C market, we fix everything, you don't understand the problem if that's what you're saying. If we just pay the farmers a better price, we fix everything. No, that's not true. That's not true. If you can give them a wad of cash, if they don't know how to use that cash effectively so that they can reinvest it into the farm in scaling their market, their producing practices so that they're producing specialty coffee, or so that they know how to get relationships happening with buyers so that they can secure their long-term supply chain. Giving producers more money is just one part of fixing this situation that we have created on this end of the supply chain. So back to the report. Then the report goes into who the data donors are, and there's 38 of them for the 2018 report. And when you look at these data donors, they come from 17 different countries, and these are people who I would say, knowing a lot of them, typically pay very fair prices for coffee. So one would expect that the data that's being collected is going to be indicative of the higher end of what people are paying. Is that correct?
So again, always with the caveat as the researcher that says without knowledge of sort of the invisibles, I have heard the same thing, that and the people on that group are very self-reflective. If you had to describe us, especially the first 21, but the next 38. But my suspicion is when you see 55 this time, you'll probably start looking, going, wow, there certainly is more diversity and plurality among the data donors. There's a few folks in there that I wouldn't have suspected, but your mind will start switching probably to the folks that aren't there, right, as opposed to the ones that are there. And that's what we hope to do over the next 3 to 5 years, right? So the issue for me relates to, is there any obvious reason that you should dismiss the numbers in the guide? You would dismiss them if somebody was trying to overclaim. So that's one of the reasons why it's really important for us to put the data donors, because people then can map in their own head. And it's perfectly okay for anyone to take a benchmark and go, we as a company always take the medians in the specialty coffee transaction guide and we subtract 15 cents because, but it's always perfectly okay for someone on the other side to go, I still think this reflects a moribund history. So we always start with the median and add 15%. So what you do as a market actor, right, is you put context, and it's our job to annotate appropriately, and it's our job to document appropriately.
Right.
it's also really important that that number grows, and this is where Chad's awesome. But also and I want to go back to a point that I'll try to say it a little better this time when I talk about the progressivity.
What does that word mean? What did you say? The progressivity. Sorry, it cut out right as you said that.
Oh, sorry.
And it sounded like you said progressivity, and I'm like, exactly, I've never heard of that word before.
Lovely on my part. Yeah, so you just, now I've forgotten what I was going to say. Oh yeah, when I say progressive, I have this, it's easy for me to go, there's 3 good people in the world and there's 95% nefarious actors, and these guys, like, they'll all Mr. Burns and go, we cannot give them that information, because I think that everybody knows that they're creating a context which down the road in specialty coffee will create more pressure, for them. If it's successful, it will create more pressure because it sort of democratizes information. And in that sense, people being willing to, participate in this guide to make sure that we do have better collective information underpinning the market that can plot its evolution over time, that can let people know when they think that the high end of the Panamanians seem to be getting a little expensive for us, or I firmly believe that the high end of the Salvadorians are underpriced. Like, these are all things that you can do with the information. Instructions to your buying team, I don't expect they're going to basically all of a sudden saying, your job is to give the producers as much as they need. They're going to go back instead of say, we're going to pay this much above the medians for these ones, I don't want to go any higher than this for those ones. They're going to have buying instructions. They're going to try to come in and say, I want my supply to come in at a reasonable price. But they're investing in a context where the people on the other side are going, that doesn't quite work for us. Right? So I think that what we need for that group going, so never an excuse for someone to go, oh, the information in here is not nearly as useful to me as the C price, right? Because what I would love to do in specialty coffee, just like you were saying before, it's only coffee, like the freeze-dried instant coffee and the Stumptowns are only coffee to the extent to which they're rooted in the same bean or same cherry, right? But they're very, very different beverages. And so the idea that this is a better set of references for us to begin conversations. And so as Chad keeps pulling in 15 more of these amazing companies, every year, then people start looking more at what we're doing. And we produce research insights, and we produce data briefs, and we produce conversations about where fault lines and prices are. We support other folks that want to compare cost of production, right, to prices kind of at different places and in different niches. Like, all of that stuff, then all of a sudden, instead of us having some of these conversations with, brokers and traders and commodity market folks over here telling you kind of how pricing works, we have this wonderfully dedicated resource over here that's providing a much more appropriate structure to that market.
I wonder, I have a lot of questions around this situation, only because there's a line. As someone who's trained as a scientist, there's a lot of lines that are being blurred with regards to this, and regards to not data integrity from the way it's being analyzed, but there is a payoff for providing your data. There's also a payoff for not providing your data. And we don't get a clear enough picture of the situation. Like, I'm looking at the names on this list, and I don't know that until your data donors are into the thousands, I don't know that people are going to start saying, all right, this is a number where perhaps not just the elite, well, the kings amongst gods of coffee are contributing. You know what I'm saying? It's because I look at this and all I'm seeing right now is people who have supposedly nothing to hide. Like, they're very vocal on most of these people, a lot of these people publish their prices on their websites.
Well, I wouldn't say a lot of those people do. I would say some of those people do, but not a lot, right? So
A fair number of them.
5 maybe. Carabella, I know, does. Coffee Collective does.
Phoenix
Onyx
does.
not on.
Onyx does.
Oh, it's not on that list yet. But,
Nordic Approach does. I believe Ritual does. Enough of them do.
Right.
That's starting to signal people who are looking at this to say, oh, right, so this is the coffee rich elite that are doing this. You know what I'm saying? And they're not the coffee rich elite.
Yeah.
But this is one of those situations. And again, this is a starting point for anyone who's listening.
Absolutely. And that goes back to, so my concern in the beginning was exactly when Chad raised this to me, was exactly the one that you're articulating. You're going to end up in a situation where you're just going to preach to the very most visible choir, right? And everyone else going to roll its eyes and there they go again. Right? But if you look at the evolution of the donors over time,
right?
Now, and again, I think it's perfectly okay to say that what this does is it reveals your progressivity, right? Are you prepared to make investments, tangible investments that have costs and benefits, right, to create a context that is more productive for us, moving forward? That's what I mean by progressive. I think there's an awful lot of folks that are coming in with each wave, all right, and instead of going, I don't trust your motivations, I don't like the group, all those initial things are going to the next pace going, so how much time and effort is this going to take? Which again is another perfectly valid business decision.
Right.
If you're asking me to bend over backwards, contort, and get 2 PYs for 2 months to produce your data, I'll go, you're going to probably have to pay me for that.
Right.
But if we keep it relatively straightforward, and then all we have to do, again, the beauty of producing something that has to compete in specialty with the C price is I was more appropriate than the C the first time we did it. All right, because even though the signal to noise things has all kinds of questions, you would say, well, how much of the 81s, 84s, 89s are actually housed in the movement of the C price? And you would go, none, right? And so,
well, we don't know because specialty can be traded on the C just like commercial can be traded on the C.
Oh yeah, you can go one way, but if you had to make a bet and say, the core kind of price that we're basing our negotiations on being the C, which is an amalgam of recent transactions. It's different in its mechanics, but it's not different in terms of what it is. Right?
I guess a fundamental difference between this and the C as well is that, and here we introduce the idea of a speculator, and that these numbers are purely dealing with people who are involved in the industry. Mm-hmm. They are the only ones that are influencing the price because I'm assuming a lot of this is relationship buying. Whereas the C market involves speculators who have nothing to do with the industry. Yep. If you haven't listened to this podcast before, speculators are people who trade on the C market. The C market is an exchange. It's a colloquial term. If you try to look it up, you'd usually see it as the ICE exchange. Mm-hmm. But the C market, as we tend to affectionately refer to it, is the exchange that coffee is anonymously traded on in a future, for the future. And so because of that, because you don't have to trade on the C market and take ownership of the coffee, you can be a speculator. So that's somebody who is just looking to make money. They'll buy a contract today, sell it tomorrow at a higher price than what they paid for it, and make money. Now, people who are trading, people in the coffee industry can also trade on futures, and not take ownership of the coffee as a way to hedge or to mitigate their risk. Mm-hmm. And they, in those situations, are also playing a weird kind of fuckery with regards to the price, because they have no intention of taking ownership of the coffee either. But it is a way of protecting their position, as they call it. And so that's a fundamental difference for anyone who's trying to get what the difference between specialty prices is versus the difference in what the C market is. There are many more players involved in the C market versus relationship buying. And this transaction guide, from what I can see here, and correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, but It deals quite a lot with people who are working specifically with relationship buying.
Yeah, it certainly is conditioned on the specialty, right? And the specialty is much more conducive to the relationship buying because it typically, if you look at the prerequisites for being in the guide, you need to have been cupped and cupped above 81. That by itself implies some form of a relationship that's in place.
Right.
Yeah, so that's yeah, absolutely, and that's the one thing because we too tend to get pulled back and forth. And if I'm speaking as my most disciplined self, I will always remind people like I think that there are two price crises out there. The crisis number one is the one that we've been talking about, dawn of time, see price down below. The second crisis is specific to specialty, and it's basically the inability to sort of participate on the upside, right, of the specialty coffee market. And so seeing kind of this, what I like to affectionately refer to as my skateboard ramp, right? So when you the large volumes of near 80, then you're going to go, well, that's not so far away from trade minimums and all this kind of stuff. And says, yeah, but what you really want to see in specialty is you give people more of what you want, implied by micro lots and implied by higher qualities, then it's being able to participate in that. And the challenge sometimes about the different solutions. So for example, proffering kind of a new minimum price, for coffee, I think is one of those things that you would discuss that in the context of what you would call the traditional coffee price crisis. But the whole notion of sort of mitigating downside risk is very different than participating in upside. And so when I go back to the 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 coffee growers that talk about this idea of I got a fairly small lot that's pretty special, right? The economics of the small farm over time says, can you stabilize the lower end and can you participate in the upper end? And for that reason, I am, as we have gone from 21 to 38 to 55 and seeing kind of the evolution, I am comfortable that at least based on my sort of fairly naive expectations coming in, that our ability to recruit a diversity of data donors has just been amazing. The gaps that Chad and I are probably most concerned with, and we'll fix over the next 3 to 5 years, is we don't have any Asian buyers in our data set, mostly because of networks where we have been very reliant on Chad's connections and friends of friends connections in there. And so we're light on certain buying regions and we're light on certain producing regions, relatively speaking. And that's the sort of thing over time that I'd like to see us fix, is to make sure that we have good representation. And I think as long as that group of donors keeps expanding, I actually don't think, I had this number like 100. If you actually ran our transaction guide based on kind of 100 folks where everybody could see somebody in here represents something that I'm interested in, and they don't see the big old holes in the sample, right? Then someone's going to say, I'm still prepared to kind of wade into the data here, and we will have our conversations about prices that are sort of anchored on.
Right.
In a weird way, that's the Dow Jones Industrial Average does not track all stocks. It's just that people have to make sure that it represents all stocks. And so.
And this conversation is going to be very different in 10 years. In 10 years, you and I will get on this podcast and we'll talk about the fact that, remember how cute the guide was in the first and second and third year?
What? Could you say that? What?
Stop.
No, I mean, when this runs as a good old utility, right, where every year people do this and you do it pro forma and people kind of go, there's no risks associated with doing it. We all know how to do it. I think this, hopefully what we're going to also see is just a ton of research projects, being done off this.
Evolve from it.
And we're still going to see a massive amount of injustice and inequality. And if we're at all successful, it will just be in a different place. Like I used to, say things in the wine industry, and people say, there's injustice in the wine industry, right? It's not the vineyard owner, it's the people who pick the grapes. And going, of course.
Same in coffee.
Yeah, it's exactly. And this goes back to the point of going, will you solve this? No, but if you're stuck into the problem space, right, you'll continue to be a protagonist in the direction of solutions. And that's what I tell students. Now the best you can ever do is get stuck into a problem, right, and be a long-term asset for problem solvers, right, as opposed to this idea, like you said, I've tech blockchained and I've solved it, and just wait for the cavalry and several lines of code, right, and this is done. I think people who know coffee know that this is considerably considerably more complicated than that.
A wee bit. I would agree with you there, sir. The added problem I think that we have is that we have built business models based on the fuckery of the prices.
Yeah.
And so therein lies the even further complexity of fixing this is, I've built a business model based on paying
absolutely
a shit price for coffee.
Absolutely. You wonder why there's an awful lot of entrepreneurs right on this side, is because the market has conditioned the cost of goods sold to be very, very attractive, which is another reason why we'd like to snap our fingers. I think an appropriate version of the future allows some of these folks to adjust. And so because you're right, I sit there and I write my initial business plan, and all the expectations of everybody else in terms of compensation, including return on my investment, in the beginning, are all conditioned on these other prices. And I have said over and over again, I don't think people screw farmers because they elect to. I think people currently screw farmers because they can. Right?
The model allows them.
Is that?
It encourages it.
It's just, it all flows down. And so slowly over time, and again, all of my around the transaction guide investments are going to be going down to origin. I always chuckle. I said, no one ever comes to business school to learn how to make minimum wage, right? So there's certain things that we do in business school that can be useful to people who sell differentiated products. So our 2-day workshops are basically, we talk about storytelling, we talk about relationship management, we talk about price expectations, and we have a very clear notion of, if you want to get from where you are to where you're going, let's just start talking about the outlines of a plan, right? And let's talk about where the requisite resources are coming from. It's heavy lifting, right, on that side. And first of all, it's also massively gratifying. So it's awesome.
I can imagine that your job doesn't suck at all. Let's keep going with the guide. So then table 2 talks about we're talking about yield year on year here. We're talking about the number of contracts in the 16-17 harvest versus 17-18 harvest.
Yep.
And so in 16-17, so that's the first year that the guide came out, there were on average 8,500 contracts.
Yep.
And in the second year of the guide, there was 8.7 thousand contracts. And those were indicative of less than, so in the first year, it was 147 million pounds of coffee. And in the second year, it was 139 million pounds of coffee. Now, help me understand, how is that? So this is just for specialty, or this is...
So all of the data, so that would be, now to be fair, there weren't 2 years of the guide. The first iteration of the guide had 2 years of data in it. So the first data donors we asked people for, last year and the year before.
Okay.
That's a nitpicking point. So we basically go this, and the things that you sign off on is, we would like all of your contract data. The definition for specialty is it was cupped, and it cups north of 80 points.
Okay.
And so the 38 data donors, right, represented about 8,500 contracts in the first harvest and about 8,700 contracts in the second. And then you basically just take every contract has a volume attached to it. So you multiply, contracts, and that gives you the total volume. And then because we know the price, we basically have the total value. And that's to give you an indication of, everybody should be allowed to be as cynical about the project as the data suggest, right? So if you look at this thing and go, but that only represents 2%, 3%, 5%, whatever you think the denominator is, then you have every right to go, I'll watch this, but I won't take it seriously until it hits what? Good news is, I think we might be double that. Yeah, so as we went from 38 to 55, I think we may be north of 16,000 contracts this year. Okay. So we're just collecting that data now. So we've, that's sort of double in scope in 1 year is pretty awesome.
That's awesome. So then we go, as we progress through it, we start talking about FOB prices. Just a reminder for anyone who doesn't know what that means, FOB is free on board, and it is the price that is paid. If you were to think about, let's clump the whole producer and the mills and the quiotes and all of that together, and then get it to a price where it lands on the boat, that it's going to be, it's all inclusive of everything that came before it being on the boat,
including the exporting fees.
Including exporting fees. So that's what free on board is. And then we look at a table that says 2 years of FOB prices, and including those same amount of contracts on the lower end price, which is the 5th percentile. So you're talking about the bottom 5% there, correct?
Set aside the bottom 5% and set aside the top 5%, because you don't want this thing to be skewed, or inferences to be skewed by, we have a couple of data points in there for all kinds of different reasons that might have paid a nickel, for coffee, but that's not in the distribution, it's off the distribution. And the same thing if someone pops in $100 because it's their Nana's coffee, then that also gets taken off too. So
standard statistics practice. Yeah. So the bottom end of things that we're looking at in the range of $1.40 to $1.54 per pound, and on the high end of things we're talking 7.25 down to 6.7. Yeah. So those two extremes have been eliminated, and the median price, so the number right in the middle, excuse me, in the first one is $2.89 per pound, and in the second guide is $2.91 per pound. So already we're coming to something that both of those numbers are very close to each other. Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we like, because again, when something's new and involves data cannot fully surprise you. It also has to make you feel comfortable.
Damn straight.
And so one of the things that we're sort of comfortable with is it has greater year-on-year stability, right, in it. That and especially once you start getting into the different quality and the quantity buckets, you do see movements and you expect movements. But if you start seeing sort of wide swings in the middle of the distribution that are unsensible, then you start questioning your data. And so it elucidates a little bit of confidence when you look at those year-to-year numbers.
And I think it's important to help people understand that the reason that, and we spoke about this with Chad last week, the reason that a data point like FOB is being used in something like this is not ideal. Mm-hmm. Ideally, we would be using things like all the data points that come up to that FOB price. So we would like to know what the producer got paid, and what the quiote got paid, and what the wet mill got paid, and the dry mill, and all of that. We'd love to know that. Except remember, friends, we are trying to get some sort of consistency happening here and reliability happening here. And so because there is a very complex supply chain matrix, remember, it's like a web, it's not linear. So we can't turn around and say that there are data points that are consistent throughout the whole supply chain before FOB, because there simply isn't. To turn around and say, well, people throw around the word farm gate. I wish we had a standard definition in our industry for what farm gate is, but we don't. No. There are farmers who sell cherry as whole cherry. There are farmers who sell the finished product that goes and gets shipped directly to be exported. And because of those complexities, using things like farm gate, using things like what's the dry parchment price and all of is just simply not good statistics gathering. We cannot process data that doesn't underpin its integrity in consistency.
Yep. And that, if you just look at it, that going back to what our narrowest objectives are, the C price is an FOB price, right? So this is just a better set of FOB references. Also want to shout out to all of our data donors who are also advisors to the project, very cognizant, right, of the sort of things that we need to do to provide greater transparency on the road from farm gate to FOB. It's a different kind of project. And so what we hope to do is not walk away from the idea that it's irrelevant, but say, for the purposes of this particular artifact, the guide, all contracts have that FOB price. It's just a better center of gravity. And then we start looking at using our networks on the ground to start painting where are those places where farmers are and are not doing better or worse when it comes to the ability to transfer cherries that are grown on farms, right, to finished coffee that sits in containers and is sold FOB. And so we hope to participate in those projects moving forward, but it'll be complementary to the guide, which again, whose aspirations is to basically recenter and reorient the market.
Right. So what data do you ask for?
Oh boy, we ask for a lot just because we anticipate doing some research, but we require. So if you look at what the guide has, we need the date that the contract was completed. We need the FOB price that was built into it. We need lot size. We need to know the name and the location of the grower. And if I haven't said the quality score yet, we need the quality score as well.
So you don't ask for anything else other than that?
We ask for a whole ton elsewhere because we're going to do, for example, a data brief on certifications. So saying, can you also tell us whether or not the coffee has any certifications, and if so, what? We ask questions like, was it a fixed price contract, or were there sort of differentials based into it? Because we'd like to look down the road as whether or not there's different pricing dynamics under sort of different contracting regimes. We have an indicator that says, where was the coffee destined? Oh my goodness, someone
Amazon.
Just came to my door. I don't. Do you mind?
No, go for it. Go for it. No problem.
Okay, give me 2 seconds. Tell them a little bit about it. You can recap. I'll be right back.
Oh dear, it's life. I am noticing that there are some questions actually coming through on the chat for this live podcast. Could cherry and green can be calculated together as they are generally accepted? Dylan, actually, there's no way that you can have the same, you can include those in the same thing. They're two different commodities. They're two different products per se. Cherry is treated as a different product because of the processing that's required from the cherry to get to the green. So just so that you know.
Just so everybody knows, my bathroom paraphernalia just arrived into our new house and it will be installed later on today.
Excellent.
So
we're all very happy for you.
Pennies from heaven.
Oh, that's so much fun. I was just referring to a question that came through in the chat. Someone was asking, could cherry and green be calculated together as they are generally accepted conversations? And they're two different products. So you cannot be pricing cherry and green the same way because they weigh different amounts. They are very, very different products, just so that...
Yeah. We have this wonderful, so there is this interesting thing that comes up. If you want to provide guidance to growers that participate at different stages, right, along the chain. So I sell cherry, I sell Pergamino, right. I sell finished. The way that we're finding you have to break it down is you can use sort of standard conversions to go back and saying, like, is there evidence that suggests that you might be being underpaid, right, for the ultimate price of your coffee?
Right.
But then we also have to be very open to say you can't just basically decide I'm selling cherry today and I'm going oro, or finished coffee next season. Then you have to say, if you want to plan together, says, okay, processing and selling are very different. Right, if you're turning cherries over to your cooperative versus you're taking coffee,
right,
straight to export. So it's one of those things that it is one of those things that the new regime, if we are successful, will create complexities at origin for people that have never had the opportunity, right, to sort of participate and think in this way.
Well, it also sounds like what you're aiming to do with this is to highlight the nuance, which is, something that we've been very bad at as an industry. The idea of making the nuance stick out like a sore thumb so that people understand the difference between the fact that different supply chains operate very differently and with taking into account that there are absolutely no standards. I think the only standard that we have, an agreement that we have, and even that changed at some point, is the idea that we score specialty at 80. That's the cutoff. That's the base minimum. That's about the only standard that we have. And even that, if you look at it, there was a time when everybody, and I'll tell you now, we had a conversation last year in Australia at a conference that Map It Forward ran. When we asked people in the room what they thought specialty coffee was, just the specifics of the number of what the score was, it ranged anywhere from 80 to 85. We would expect that at least the industry could agree uniformly that the scoring number, everybody agreed on the same.
It is one of those things. Again, when you look at things closely and consistently, you begin to see nuances.
Right.
And I would just say, if somebody were to say, how would you classify, specialty? I would say, for what reason? Part of the reason is, if we all want to gather in one spot, we need to know who's in and who's out of the group. But if someone said, we're seriously documenting quality scores down to 75, in my project, would I go, oh, so terribly sorry, we're the specialty coffee transaction guy, we're only going to report?
La-di-da.
Because one of the things, if I go back to the advice that you would give to producers, right, you go, let's just say right now you're currently consistently at about 77, right?
Yep.
And you want to know the implications of basically what I might expect at 77 versus 79 versus 81 versus 83. Right. What I would like is, I would like to have information to say, if I'm forward looking and I'm thinking 5 and 10 years out from now, do I have a chance of getting to those quality scores? You would talk to an agronomist, not to a business school professor, right? But can we actually provide advice in terms of what I might expect at the middle and upper and lower end of the distributions when I get there? Right. And then this allows us to support. This goes back to my conversations with the folks who write on commodities, this migration matrix. Where are you now? Where you want to go? Do you want to stay in coffee? Do you want to increase your quality to do whatever? Do you want to plant more? Do you want to plant less?
Diversify, whatever.
Do you want to take some of your farm and micro lot it to the high prices? Do you want to migrate more of your ordinary coffee up? All these different things. These decisions are made with better information. And to be honest, there is nothing in the guide that says what you have to pay or what you're going to pay, right? These are all things that sort of, you anchor a market, and this is where conversations begin. And
right.
At the end of the day, how come somebody got $10.25? How come I can't get that? Well, I'm going to take a guess and go, because you're not famous. Right. So I'm going to guess if you become a famous grower, right, then I'm going to guess you can probably command extraordinary prices for your coffee.
Well, and there are people who do, and that's another nuance. That's a part of the complexity of this whole thing. Yeah. Now, keeping going with the guide, what it says is that the median price over the last two guides has shown to be paid at about, let's say, $2.90 for consistency's sake. I want to throw a question at you.
Yeah.
We don't know yet what the average cost of production is. Mm-hmm. We don't know what the average cost of doing business is for a coffee farmer at the various levels, for a bunch of reasons. How is the guide going to be able to tell us, or how does the C even able to tell us whether we're paying a fair price or not, if most producers have no fucking idea if they're covering their costs?
So again, you go back and talked about actor in a market versus what a market does, right? I mean, I remember I was at a panel, we were talking about sustainability. Some guy stood up and said, I pay this price. How do I know if it covers cost of production? And I said, listen, there's a certain purposeful naivety in my response, right? But in the world that I'm trying to create, that's not your problem, right? Your problem is basically saying, this is what I think I can pay for that coffee, right? And then the producer, the seller, is about to say, I will not sell it to you for that much.
Right.
Markets,
which requires empowerment.
Yeah, exactly. Which is what this is about. This is why it's 5 and 10, and this is about producing a more sort of egalitarian or open or transparent framework. Now, be points in a producer is going to sell for less than she wants? Absolutely. Will there be some particularly bad circumstances where I had to dump a product, right, at less than what I paid to produce it? I always just tell people, I said, if you look at normal business activity anywhere, right, you get certain things where people make money, people lose money, people make mistakes, all that kind of stuff. The way that you ensure that folks kind of on average, or at least in a vector, is I say I empower the producers to understand what their own costs are, right? We empower them to look in the context. Does the market suggest that it's feasible for you to not only cover your costs, but get the kind of return that you want from your farm? Right? And then you go back and say the risk for you is that price goes down to $1.40 and that price is observed up to like $3.90, right? And you say, right, boy, if I get above the 70th percentile, then I'm going to be happy. And going, well, it's harder to get above the 70th percentile than it is to get above the 30th, right? And every now and again, when people talk about business planning, going, you should plan to the 30th, right? And get excited at the 50th percentile and be euphoric, right, at the 70th. So these are the sort of...
They don't understand any of this anyway.
They will when we're done, because that's I always like chuckle to people. You don't come to business school to learn minimum wage, and at the end of the day, basic business concepts are not that hard. And the fact that you've had a chance to be socialized to them, and you get yourself in conversations with folks that are also socialized to them. And again, everybody that has the chance works in the direction of empowerment to say, there's managing my position in the market, and there's also kind of managing the evolution of the market. And going back to the underlying, do I think this will work? Not always. Do I think this is the only chance, is to come and connect and empower producers? That's the direction in which I want to lean anyway.
Ever the optimist.
What was that?
Ever the optimist.
Anyone who knows me knows that there's no optimism in me at all. Do you think it's going to work? No. Yes. We're on a podcast.
I'm insistent on making sure that people don't view me as an optimist or a pessimist. I'm a realist. And, my training in science as well as my work in data analysis has taught me, just having to deal with humans as an entrepreneur in general will teach you there is danger in being either of those two things.
Yes, you inserted the word entrepreneur, right? Like, what makes markets more progressive over time is the invitation and the support of promising entrepreneurs. And so the idea that certain farmers out there, certain of the next generation of farmers out there going, you give me a problem space that I can lean into, right? That I'm prepared to push this, right? You give me the context in which my parents and grandparents lived in, not the least bit interested. Right.
And that's where I see the hope. I see, and we've had some of them on the podcast, I see some very exciting, promising second, third or fourth generation entrepreneurial actors who have inherited farms or who are going to inherit farms that are saying, listen, mum or dad or grandma or grandpa, we are noticing that there's a shift, and while you're still running things here at the farm, we're going to head to America, Australia, Europe and whatnot, and we're going to work on establishing the front end of our supply chain and build relationships with people so that we can start ensuring that our coffee is well on the way to being 100% sold before it gets on the container.
Anybody that listens to you and immediately invokes this notion of the over-resourced and over-privileged coffee families, I will introduce the 3 or 4 folks like the Marguerites that I have known that do not come, from well-advantaged positions. So this is something where we have to work harder to bring ramp to certain entrepreneurs. But I have literally I've seen in the work that we do in neighborhoods around the US, and I've seen it now in coffee, like the most awesome thing about leaning into these entrepreneurs is that someone told me this in the entrepreneur support programs. The good thing about working with entrepreneurs is they give you this amazing return on investment for like a little investment.
Take it from me as an entrepreneur.
Thank you for being the best thing that ever. I think I went to Guatemala for 2 days and watched as you interacted with mentors. I think that's all I did, right? Yeah. And this kind of stuff goes, yes, but I'm going, I'll take that credit.
Well, it's also just a thing of a lot of the time, entrepreneurs just need someone to say, have you thought about this? or yes, you're doing a great job, or
let me introduce you to.
Right, just push harder. Now, the other thing is, because being an entrepreneur is, I want to say it's a thankless job, but it's not that it's a thankless job. It's a lonely job. It's an isolating job. Yep. If you're a real entrepreneur, you're always living on the cutting edge of new ideas. That's your job.
You just described the professor's job too.
I did. Well,
it's lonely.
Yeah. Look, my entrepreneurial endeavors are two very cutting edge coffee endeavors. You know, this podcast, which is all about professional career and business development in the coffee industry. Nobody's doing that other than us. The other side of things, I've got a bottled beverage that we're the only ones in the world that make. Both of those businesses are hard as fuck to run, and they're very isolating, and they confuse the shit out of me and excite the fuck out of me every single day. I am living a very rich life.
Yes.
Neither of them are going to make me rich anytime soon. But that's not unusual for every single entrepreneur that's out there that isn't occupying the tech space. So, you know, I'm able to manage my expectations and understand that the life currencies that I'm trying to build wealth in, that this affords me the ability to do. I'm also engaging in a very important conversation about a very interesting time in history in the industry that I'm in. This is all the fuckery that's come before now is culminating to this moment in time, and it is going to be a big bang birthing moment that's either going to lead to a new way of doing business, or it's going to lead to the collapse of an industry. And it's an exciting time to be in coffee, and I want to be a part of, as do most of the people that come on this podcast, want to be a part of conspiring to the success of where that big bang goes. And I can see that really clearly in the intention behind the transaction guide. I would implore anybody who wants to understand what the transaction guide is about, just to, and we're not in any way wrapping this up, but this is an important time to say this. If you're considering becoming a data donor, I would say just reach out to these folks and just have a chat to them. Just see what's involved. See if you can contribute. Am I right, Peter, in understanding that there's no financial commitment required?
Nope, no, not at this point in time. We'll talk. We always have conversations about sustainability, and ultimately, this thing, if it's going to become sort of as good as it can be and be as reliable, we'll talk about, voluntary contributions, to keep the project going. But right now it's, the most important thing that, the two things that we get from our data donors, we ask and we're getting, is on the one hand, the data, and the other hand is, give us your best ideas and critiques of the program. I always chuckle because I literally get the same concern about our project from people that are participating in it, and from people that, deep down inside kind of want to just tell you you're wrong so they can shut it down. And I like the guys that we're working with right now, because they're going, man, there's 1,000 flaws of this, but the status quo is kind of obnoxious. So let's push this forward and see where we go with this. And that is that part. And it goes a little bit, piggyback on what you were saying about this inflection point. There's a lot of good people, right, kind of in this, and don't necessarily agree all the time, but agree that, something needs to be done, and agree that this has the right sort of aspirations and orientation, to ultimately be successful. So excited about that.
It's also, what I want to say is, and folks, head to the blog post that I released yesterday, as well as the one from the week before, if you want to get more details about this. This is an opportunity, and we have a very small window now. We don't know if we can fix this situation, and we have a very small window if we are going to be able to fix it. But one very concrete, very, very doable, concrete way that you can contribute to conspiring towards the success of the future of our industry is to start working immediately on securing your supply chain by relationship buying with farmers, either directly or via way of importer. And what I mean by that, maybe Peter, you can speak some more towards this. If you are just buying coffee directly off an importer and going just off taste, just deciding that you will cup coffee with an importer and say, I'll take 20 bags of this and 10 bags of that and blah, 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 blah. That's one way of buying, but it's a very short-sighted way of buying. If you, on the other hand, go to a buyer and say, so this is my buying philosophy. I would like to buy coffees that score this much. This is the price range I have to pay for them. I want to work with farmers who are interested in sustainability. I want to buy coffee from farmers who have some sort of a trajectory in the way that they want to improve their farms. And I'd like you to I'd like to meet them, either over Skype or over WhatsApp, and then eventually, hopefully, once you've built your business enough, be able to go and visit them on the farm. This is a very concrete way that you can help smallholder producers and in turn help yourself. This is a win-win situation rather than just buying coffees of an importer whereby you have hundreds of coffees available to you. You start to build a selection for your customers that perhaps you will only work with up to 10 coffees a year, every year. And they're coffees that your customers get to know year in, year out, and you start to build a relationship with the farmer. You start to see them grow. They start to build a loyalty with you. And I'm sure, I really believe this is what's going to happen. I think that as smallholder producers, and I'd love to hear what you think on this, Peter, as smallholder producers are pushed out of business, we start to centralize. We're going to see the globalization of coffee. Yeah. And as we see the globalization of coffee happen more rapidly because of things like climate change and this price crisis, etc., when they experience a crisis, let's say they get some frost and 80% of their crop is wiped out, that's when we'll start to really be beholden to the power that the globalization of coffee is going to have. Is that true?
Oh, you said a lot.
I did.
That's, I think, so I always like to start with this idea, so markets are these systems, the status quo, it's like physics, right? All the different energies are processed and we have an outcome that's unsatisfying. The great thing about a market is it processes a whole lot of different energies and a whole lot of different interventions. So some people get paralyzed at saying, do I have to be my best version of myself all the time and everywhere? And the answer is no, you don't. I think there's some actors in the market that have to push that consumer valuation piece that says, the fact that we're sort of addicted to, gas station coffee prices and, getting coffee over $1 a cup. So I think people should be pushing that idea that says, listen, man, you should be drinking better coffee and you should be paying for it. And then I think there should be other people that remind everybody, says, but you're paying for origin because that's what creates your quality. So some people are going to make sure that people can connect those dots.
What do you mean by paying for origin?
It's really hard to tell people why a coffee is awesome, right, without actually sort of describing something about kind of where it comes from. So it's like it's wine and terroir. You can only go so far as going, man, I vinified the hell out of this wine, or this was my best roast ever. Like if you really want to get people excited about a coffee, you start talking about the things that derive from the plant and from the origin.
So are you suggesting that different origins are going to, and I'm unaware of this, but here is it that you as a consumer feel that different origins are going to fetch better prices with the consumer market?
I would be fall down dead surprised if that wasn't the case. In the same way that says that, in wine, you've got Chile, you've got Argentina, you've got Napa, you've got Willamette.
So it's a marketing thing.
Yeah. So it's just, the people will form preferences for regions. They'll form preferences for varietals. Right. Some people will learn that varietal comes best from that region. I mean, that whole sort of cascade of kind of like how you end up appealing to more people. And then right. Just going back to this idea of the value chain, make sure that you're leaning in the direction, right, of, saying, listen, if I want more of this kind of amazing, then I got to make sure that right down to the end, that I'm cognizant of where the bottlenecks are and where the imperfections. And you could do that from a very selfish perspective, right? I adore this coffee. If we don't figure out how to keep these farmers paid, I'm not going to get my coffee anymore, right? That's a perfectly valid motivation to intervene in a market to make sure. Once you start looking at how markets work, like actually carrying cash, right, and giving it to producers, like, is really hard because of how value chains work. And so I don't necessarily think that you have to be a data donor to support our project. I think what you need to, like, a lot of times is going to be why don't you use the guide, right, as the basis for your conversations about prices? So the use value, for every 55 people that we had that contribute, we've had 2,500 plus downloads, right, of the guide. Mm-hmm. And if you want to talk about 55 as underrepresented, 2,500 is way too small. And I tell farmers, and when they say, hey, I read your guide, and go, did you tell your neighbors to? I'm like, what? I said, did you tell your neighbors to? Because, someone right now in a negotiation can credibly say, but I can get this coffee cheaper next door. But I said, if your neighbors all read the guide, you'll have sort of a common reference points. So I'd like to see you should encourage download. You should encourage use. If the people you're buying from have read our guide and want to talk about why the prices they're paying, right, are so far off the distributions, you can either be retrogressive and go and try to make them feel foolish. Oh, that's that creepy professor from Emory University. We don't take that stuff seriously. Everyone knows it's C plus a 15 cent or whatever. Then you should know.
You're not creepy.
Oh, I am.
Just so you know.
Oh, rest assured. I have unadorned bathroom equipment over there. He's looking. Anyway, but all that thing around the idea say you can lean into projects, right, without actually being full-on participant. And I think there's a lot of folks in different kinds of value chains. If I lean into a market that ensures, right, that the various folks are being paid, then the beauty of it is I don't have to worry about it. So again, just another personal reference, no one ever asks before they come to Emory University Business School, how much does Peter Roberts get paid, right? They assume that I can take care of myself. And that's where we'd all like to be. It's as if the market was such where it had the appropriate transparencies, it had the appropriate connectivity, then I could just offer a certain amount for coffee, right? Because that's what I want to pay, right? And someone's gonna say, ooh, I can't give you our 89s at that price because they're going at whatever. But I'll tell you what, I can introduce you to someone and get you a nice 84, right? That's a well-functioning market.
So this $2.90 that we've got here, what scores are we looking at with that?
That's why you can't, when people stop there and they roll their eyes, right, what they'll say is, surely you're not telling me that an 89 is the same as an 81, or surely you're not telling me that container is the same as a micro lot. That's why we have to say, well, keep it, right? And that's when we sort of break it down to the 5 quantity buckets and break it down to the 5 quality buckets. And our signature table in the guide is table 6, which basically, that's the closest thing to a summary of the blue book, that we have right now. Right. Which says, so I'm looking at, first of all, it tells you that it's very, very difficult to get a container of 89 plus coffee, which doesn't surprise a lot of people. Not a lot of micro lots sold at 80, 81, which doesn't surprise people. But all of those kind of cascades in there that kind of tell you those are the kind of places where you probably want to be situated. Once we decide that this is roughly the quality we're talking about, and once we sort of know, are we in the micro lot world or the container world or somewhere in between, then you basically say, well, let's talk about where that distribution looked like last year. Where should we jump into this conversation? And,
So let's just having a look at the data so that people can get some reference of what we're talking about. So the median price, so for And this is a much better table to start looking at. This is table 6, and the title of the table is FOB prices for specialty coffees 2017-2018, and this is the revised one. So for the scores of 80 to 81.9, there were 244 contracts totaling 11.72 million pounds. And so these are for container loads essentially. Right? So it's broken up into brackets of 5 brackets, with the top bracket being for container loads, which is more than 40,000 pounds. The second bracket, 6.5 to 40,000 pounds. The third bracket is 2.5 to 6,500 pounds. The fourth bracket is 800 to 2,500 pounds, and less than 800 pounds, which is the micro lots. So for the container loads, for a coffee that's scoring between 80 to 80 and just under 82, the median price is $1.55 a pound. Which is, still 40 cents, 50 cents above what the C market is getting at the moment. And which is going to be coffees that are scoring closer to what we expect is being traded on the C market. And then when you look at coffees that are scoring 86 to 80, just under 88 in the same bracket, we're looking at a median price of $2.80 per pound. I would have thought it was more than that, to be honest.
There's and again, that's what data are supposed to do. And the two things that go, on the one hand, you go back and say, what's the sample look like again? That seems a little weird. That seems a little odd. Is there something wrong with your data? Or it could be, what was wrong with my priors, the conversations that I've talked about. I mean, I always make sure that I look at everything. So if you looked at the number of contracts, the 82 to 84s, there's 800 contracts. The 86 to 88, there's 125. So the fact that seems a little odd is bolstered by the fact that they're also kind of rare. And because more often than not, if you want to find out like where there's a lot of 86 to 89s, you go down to your bottom two quantity categories. That's where most of the 86 to 88s are sold. And the prices, not surprisingly, are a bit different.
Well, it suggests that if you're going to buy an 88, you want to get it for a cheap price, you've got to buy it in volume.
And a lot of things, or if you want the sell side to go down, if you're a cooperative and you have the chance, then maybe there's an opportunity to think about breaking those down. And my suspicion is the micro lots are basically the stories become more interesting as they get smaller. Because people can sell now, but then you also then flip it over and say it's a little more expensive to sell. I got to find 20 buyers to sell in lots of 2,000. Right. Whereas I can find one buyer, so all those different business decisions and what do we do? So this doesn't tell you what you should do. It just, as these numbers become more reliable, they can basically kind of tell you in which direction do you want to lean.
And folks, if you've not had any relationship with data analysis or statistics or anything like that, you've got to be patient with regards to this guide. The more data that's collected, the greater the sample size, the more information that's going to be revealed. And so you cannot expect that from the beginning of data collection that it's going to be accurate. And I just wanted people out there to know that before they start judging any of this, it's going to be a good couple of years so that we can start graphing relationships and tracking where this is going and understanding what this tells me. Like right now I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, so a container load of, let's say, 87 scoring coffees, which is something that pretty much only an importer could afford to carry the cash burden of. They're going to pay a median price of $2.80 per pound, whereas the smaller roasters who are going to be relationship buying are buying micro lots, scoring the same amount. They're paying an average price of $5.20, and so the importers are going to be making a bit more on, like, that's what the the supposed margins are going to be for importers versus people who are going direct.
Yeah.
And you can start to make some assumptions there, which I'm not going to make here, but you really can start to see some things that are going on there.
And then I would always add to that, because everybody jumps, and I guess to be fair to them, I did put it in slightly shaded, but I always like to look at this as you get, the range on the prices up at the containers, paid is much lower than the range that's paid, kind of down below.
100%.
And which again makes sense too, because usually when you're talking about the less than 800s or the less than 2500, it's so much more driven by the story than it is, the people in the industry. The ones above are probably closer to the blenders, and the ones below are the ones that I'm looking to kind of like, to induce my customers.
Right.
So there's an awful lot that goes into it. I always like to say, like, if the next year comes out, the good news about going from 38 to 55 data donors and doubling the number of contracts is, we will get a snapshot that's quote unquote twice as robust. The challenge for us is to make sure when we communicate that the changes you see year on year will have to be broken into two, right? So the price changes that you would have observed at the cohort of data donors had been unchanged, right? And the changes in prices that are attributable, right, to the fact that we actually have a larger pool of donors. And it's important for anybody, and you think on the supply side, but also, also on the buy side, is I got to be looking at where prices are going, right, in this thing, and not necessarily where they are. So that's an extra bit of patience and nuance that's required. I start looking at things like, holy smokes, are you saying that prices went down? 30 cents? I said, not necessarily. We have a different group of data donors.
And folks, if you're listening to this, and I want you to go and download the report, just so that you can start to get an understanding of what it looks like. Like I said, it's easy to read, but remember, these prices are FOB. So we still haven't got insight into what the farmers are getting paid and what the actors in between, from the pickers to the people at the mills, we don't know any of that. This is a great starting point for what we're trying to get information on. But for all of those people who contact me saying, why can't we fix this situation with blockchain technology? Why can't we fix it with an app? Friends, it is so much more complicated than that. A lot of these producers are struggling to feed themselves, having the time to consistently, because it all comes down to data integrity, getting everybody to agree that every time a certain coffee changes hands, that somebody goes in and puts the information into a blockchain, you're assuming they can afford the smartphones that are required to do that, and the apps that are required to do that, and that they've got constant access to Wi-Fi, etc., etc., etc. It's not feasible. Mm-hmm. But this is a starting point. So is there anything else, Peter, that we need to know with regards to the guide?
No, I think just you've alluded to it all the way through. The idea about thinking about, I would like folks, because this is what has impressed me, how far we have come in a year. When Chad originally introduced this idea, I would have said, number one, no one's going to give us the data, or the people that will be such a small set. And number two, no one's going to take it seriously, right? So, we'll still work at it, but let's assume those two things are going to be slow, and they're interrelated. And the final thing is that, as it grows, as the demands on the project grow, then you need the resources, financial resources, to make sure. I think the fact that we are at 55 data donors, we go from the 2018 to 2019, December to December, that's amazing, right? And so that suggests that there is a fair bit of sort of collective interest and collective momentum. But moreover, the fact that from the very beginning, it's a really, really simple project. And I think it has, whereas you don't say it solves all the problem, it's sort of, it has sort of a root cause feel, to it. So I think people are taking it more seriously. We've got an awful lot of attention and continue to get attention. And so I think that, that if we can keep that stuff going, then I think that we do move the problems, right, to, sort of more comfortable footing. And now we still have this, and this is where working with our data donors has been awesome. And this will be my words, but their sort of idea. Let's not worry so much about make this consumer facing, and don't worry so much about us, right? It's going to take a really, really keen consumer to download our transaction guide and start making their roasted coffee purchase decisions based on, it's
right.
But if you said, and the worst that will be is moderately amused or surprised, right, by some of the distributions. Producers need an awful lot of work because it's an invitation to be thinking and interacting differently. And so I think that if I had to look in, and I rather arrogantly started writing a MacArthur 100 million and change grant, thinking that if I had $100 million to spend over the next 3 years, we could maybe make a dent on this problem. Most of the money that I would spend would be on business-related capacity building work, at Origin.
It would be well spent.
But I would say that's conditioned on the belief that the world will coalesce kind of around the transaction guide as a blue book. Because all of the business stuff, I tell someone, I said, I'm looking at you right now, given the way end prices move for you all, I wouldn't invest in coffee, right? There's no way. So if you want to say you want to spend a little bit more money becoming a more reliable producer of an 81, 82, or trying to kind of shoot that part of your farm up to the 85, 86, 87, I said, if the root of pricing is C plus an unknown differential, I said, C is going to move more than the differential ever would. And there's just no way that I would ever do. So we need for this sort of sensibleness to be imported kind of as a pricing foundation for specialty. And then we have all the hard work that comes after that. So, but thanks for letting us chat a bit about it.
You're very welcome. And we're going to include some links so that people can download the report. Please go and read it. I really encourage it. Even if you think that all of this C market FOB bullshit is so hard to understand, this guide makes it easier to understand for you. So go ahead, and if anyone wants to contact you directly, Peter, I think I saw the contact details on your website, contact@transactionguide.coffee. Is that correct?
That's right.
Thanks again, mate. It was a real pleasure to have this conversation.
Yeah, I look forward to future conversations as well, maybe even face to face.
As do I. We'll talk soon. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
mate. Take care. Bye.